It's my unique and extraordinary pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Yaya van Leer. So he is currently Professor of Educational Linguistics at the Monterey Institute of International Studies, where he's been since 1986. He's impressively taught all over the world in countries like Britain, Peru, Mexico, Scandinavia, not a country I realize, the Netherlands, Spain, New Zealand, and Austria. In addition to his numerous book chapters and articles in top journals, he's the author of several books, including Scaffolding the Academic Success of Academic English Language Learners, The Ecology and Semiotics of Language Learning, Interaction in the Language Curriculum, Introducing Language Awareness, and The Classroom and the Language Learner. He serves on several editorial boards, and since 2007, he's been the editor-in-chief of the Modern Language Journal. He's also co-editor of the book series Educational Linguistics. Generally speaking, his interests include ecological approaches to linguistics and language learning, semiotics, action-based teaching and learning, agency, and identity. And finally, that his work is innovative, provocative, and ultimately highly relevant to the work that all of us do as language teachers. And so with that, I will turn over the podium to Yaya van Leer.
So, action-based teaching and learning, an ecological perspective. So there are two phrases here that you may not be totally familiar with. One is action-based teaching, the other is an ecological perspective. And I hope to give you some hints as to what they might mean through here. The first thing I want to start with is a potted or partial history of the curriculum. Now this may be very familiar because as I was walking from somewhere to the camp to maybe I saw all the names of the famous pedagogues of the world on the walls of the building. So they're all there. So you may know more about them than I do. It's possible. In that case, let me know. Okay, I started in the Middle Ages when education, sort of the Western world version thereof, began. And it began with the Trivium. That is, education was basically consisted of three areas of knowing and doing, which were grammar, which is comprehension. Interesting that grammar in those days was comprehension, rather than the ability of not making mistakes. Logic, or reasoning, and rhetoric, that is, expression and application. So that was the first model, let's say, of organized education, even though in those days there weren't schools in the sense that we have them now. And a lot of this education was limited to the elites and probably done on a single pupil tutor basis. Later on, towards the end of the Middle Ages, another area of education came to the fore, and that was the quadrivium. And the quadrivium consisted of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. So you see here that this is a shift, moving from sort of individual-oriented skills to factual knowledge, right? And that is an interesting development. And if we compare the trivium and the quadrivium together, they're called the 7 liberal arts. That phrase may be familiar to you. The trivium came first. The quadrivium came second. The trivium related to the inner being of the person, that is, relating to a person's consciousness and abilities to do things and thinking. And the quadrivium related to the outer world knowledge, because that was after the birth of science and astronomy and more inventions and so on were available. So the trivium related to processes, and the quadrivium related to facts. I need to do this sort of up and down a little bit because I gleaned these from larger talks and courses that I have given. So I take out some and put in some others. What I want to say more about this is that the word trivium, that first of all the trivium was most important, and the quadrivium was second, but pretty soon it started to work the other way around. That is, the quadrivium became all important, and the trivium became, well, trivial. So the emphasis changed from personal development and consciousness raising to the knowledge of facts. The first educator that's very important to us is, of course, Jan Comenius, 1592, 1670, who was astonishingly modern, and from whom we can still learn a lot to this very day. He felt that education had to be conducted according to nature, by which he meant, as the main principles, that you needed to learn foreign language through the L1. That is, the L1 was the path to the L2. He came up with a direct method, that is, learning through the perception of it. He also emphasized experiential learning, and that means familiar objects and experiences before abstract concepts and more abstract experiences. He also claimed that education ought to be comprehensive, holistic, and meaningful. That motivation ought to be intrinsic rather than extrinsic. And that there should be education for all. And he was particularly adamant that women should be educated on the same level as men. And that was, of course, unheard of in those days. So he was way ahead of his time, you might say. And that's why in Europe you have the Comenius Institutes and all these things where the name Comenius is so prominent, because he still provides inspiration in, for example, the Council of Europe. Second person we mention here is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whom we all know about, of course, as belonging to the Romantic period, as it is called, who believed that God makes all things good. That is, everything is good at the beginning until they get screwed up by us. Yeah. And in education, he particularly claimed also, basically what happens is that teachers mess it all up, and what begins by being good gets spoiled by the didactic efforts of teachers and, in general, authorities. If you left everything alone the way it was made by nature, everything would be good, and unfortunately, it hasn't turned out that way. The next one we have here is Pestalozzi, a Swiss educator, also 18th century. He wanted to wrest education away from what he called the outworn order of doddering old teaching hacks. Not only that, but also the newfangled order of cheap artificial teaching tricks. So I think we can still relate to that a little bit. I don't know about you, but yeah, this rings a bell somewhere, right? Of course, there are no doddering old teaching hacks in this room, but somewhere we know that somewhere, out there probably are some. And we all have heard, I think, too much about newfangled, cheap, artificial teaching tricks that come and go. So that was what he was railing against. And he wants to entrust it to the external powers of nature herself. Here comes again, the threat to Rousseau and Comenius, to the light which God has kindled and kept alive in the hearts of fathers and mothers, to the interests of parents who desire their children grow up in favor with God and with men. Again, a very romantic ideal of education as something natural something that depends on the love of parents to their children and takes that as a model. And that should not be left to the devices of all these doddering folks and snake oil salespeople. He emphasized, Pestalozzi was extremely influential in Europe. I'm not sure. I think he was also quite influential in the first part of the 20th century in the United States. I think the name Kilpatrick comes to mind, and John Dewey were influenced by the teachings of Pestalozzi. Emphasizing the inner dignity of the individual, the promise of potentiality, a very, very powerful statement here. Love and kindness, no flogging. People thought the guy was crazy. What, no flogging in school? Whatever next. Very importantly, from an ecological perspective, the doctrine of Anschauung, which means perception, the centrality of perception. Learning by action. And those of you who were in my earlier talk remember that the notion of perception and action coupled is a key to all learning. And then repetition of action after Anschauung, and that has certain interesting possibilities for the curriculum on how to design a series of tasks. So that was Pestalozzi. Next we get Johann Friedrich Herbart, and here education attempts to become scientific. As up to now we've had mostly romantic idealists who have a very strong belief in nature and the goodness of things that must not be spoiled by unthinking, selfish, inept didacticians, you might say. But Herbart came up with, he fancied himself as a psychologist, which was in those days not really generally regarded as a science yet, but to say there are the psychological processes of learning that we need to base our education on. These psychological processes can be translated into educational processes. That is, what is going on in the mind of the student and in the actions of the student can be translated into the educational processes that we need in our schools. And by doing that transformation, we can create the science of teaching. So he was trying to set education on a scientific footing. I think Herbart himself cannot be blamed for what generations of followers made of his curricular proposals, because basically I think from that resulted the division, even more so than in the Quadrivium, the division into different isolated and standalone subject matters that each have their own pedagogical discourse and become to a certain extent encapsulated and separated from one another, which means that specialists have to teach them. And since they're specialists, they guard their discourses very, very closely and do not want to be intruded upon by other people who are not specialists, etc., etc. You know the story. And I think a lot of what has happened can be traced back to Herbart, but cannot be blamed on him. That's at least my view. Poor guy had no idea what was coming. Yeah. And of course, Maria Montessori, who still is very, very influential. There were Montessori schools all over the United States, all over Europe. Unfortunately, mostly at the kindergarten level, and maybe the first few years of elementary in some cases, but it hasn't actually percolated its way up towards the higher reaches of academic activity for certain reasons that one can actually fairly easily pinpoint. And one of my favorite quotes from her is, The greatest sign of success for a teacher is to be able to say, the children are now working as if I did not exist. And that's a very interesting citation. The children are now working as if I did not exist. If that happens, if you're teaching and that happens, then you could go out of the room and they wouldn't even know that you were gone. Right? That's kind of interesting. And we could talk about the preconditions for something like that to actually be possible. And whether it's possible for, let's say, middle and high school students to be in such an environment, or graduate students, for that matter. John Dewey. I just want to read the last phrase there. Education is life itself. So lifelong, life-wide, life-deep education was basically Dewey's philosophy and deepest belief. And of course, his reform movement is well known. It was reviled widely in that time. Everything bad that happened was blamed on Dewey at one time or other. But of course, the ideas of experiential education and the processes of education that he embodied are still very strong and come back even after being criticized. Finally, Lawrence Stenhouse, who may not be so well known here, but is very well known in Britain as a curriculum theorist and a teacher educator. And I like this quote from him. He was a rebel. He really was what one might call a radical, a counter, but very, very perceptive, very deep, not just somebody who goes and shouts. He said, education as induction into knowledge is successful to the extent that it makes the behavioral outcomes of the students unpredictable, which is very interesting, I think, unpredictable. So if we were to follow that advice, and we taught in such a way that the students' outcomes would not be able to be predicted from the start, then what would happen to the testing industry? For example, to mention just one thing. Right? Where would education go? What would the politicians say? Kind of very scary not to be able to predict the outcomes of education. The whole of education is premised upon the ability to predict the outcomes, right? So that's an interesting thought. So now we go back to the present, and then maybe glimpse at the future. The curriculum is a system of structure and process. I talked a little bit about this in the afternoon. I won't go into the provenance of the structure process concept from physics, but that's where it comes from, actually. But clearly a curriculum does have structure, and a curriculum must also be a process. Again, Stenhouse said a curriculum should be carried into a room on a wheelbarrow. Well, we don't have wheelbarrows anymore in schools, I think. So you probably just bring it in the room and on a thumb drive, a 28 gigabyte thing, or a cloud, URL. But the thing is the same. The curriculum is huge. It's everything you know, everything that is important to you. It's all your beliefs and your knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. We know that. But at the same time, it is structured. And it has to be structured very carefully into a syllabus that allows for processes to occur. So it is an enabling structure for processes. The processes themselves also then create or recreate or create emergent structures themselves, by which we have a cycle, a dialogical cycle of structure process, as we go along. That may be a bit abstract at the moment, but I think I'll have some examples that may make this a little bit clearer in a moment. So we could envisage teaching as consisting of two orthogonal axes, one of planning versus improvisation, and the other of routine versus innovation. Okay, so as you plan your lessons, you could think of planning, but as you conduct your lessons, you will find that you also have to improvise, because things never work out exactly to plan. If they did, there's probably something wrong with your plan. No, could be anyway. So if you plan, and your planning is quite routine, that means that your students know exactly what to expect on Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock when the class starts, because it's every week the same. Maybe a different chapter, but predictable, right? Because they are always use the same routines and rituals, and they're well planned out, and there's nothing surprising. If you are planning your lessons and you're planning for innovation or for exploration, you could create something that you might call exploratory teaching. That is, you plan for exploration. And I'm thinking here very much of a sort of a project-based type of approach. You plan carefully, you structure carefully, but you do that so as to incite exploration. If you have nothing but routine and ritual, but it is not planned at all, you have the same non-lessons every lesson where nothing happens. There's there's no rhyme and reason. People just sit around and do whatever. And that obviously means lack of direction, both on the part of the teacher and of the student. And then if you have innovation, exploration, and improvisation, you could call that discovery. But if there's no planning involved, I think it would be a very hard thing to do, and to do for students as well as teachers, because you would never know what was going to happen. So it's not a very realistic thing, but it can be a very realistic outcome of one of the activities that you planned for innovation, so that the discovery then would happen, and you say, now with this discovery that we made, students and I, as a class, we can now build this into our future planning. Okay, so if we look at this whole thing, I think I'm going to take my laser pen, because I feel like I want to do a bit of pointing. So this goes back and forth. So exploratory teaching leads to exploration, obviously, and innovation, and could have, as a result, a discovery of unexpected events. Those unexpected events, to the extent that they are very positive, you could then fold into your future planning. And that's how exploratory teaching would renew itself constantly. On this side of the ledger, nothing much actually changes. Nothing changes. So one thing one might say is that if you're only on this side, you're probably at a dead end, because the status quo will remain forever. To move out of that, you need to go, at least for part of the time, in that direction. So if your lessons are totally predictable and or lack direction, you will not reach new ground. But if you can move towards this side, then new things can happen. It doesn't mean that ritual and routine are bad. It just means that they have to be put in the service of the structure process. This whole thing, this planning and innovation field, as a map of options and possibilities. So that I would say to teachers is, can you tell where you are? and why? And are you happy where you are? Or, given this map, can you conceive of moving around one way or another? And can you tell me why you would want to move around? So it's a map of options rather than anything else. But it does illustrate the structure-process relationship of the curriculum. That is the notion of structuring and planning, and the notion of improvisation and unpredictability, both, in some sort of balance. Okay, let's move on to the more practical side of stuff. And here I introduce again, and you saw this earlier if you were in my earlier talk, the notion of green grammar, because I'm on an ecological theme, so I want to see how we could make grammar sustainable, etc., etc. So that's really it's a project. It's an experiment in innovation, you might say, and I'm using currently a class in pedagogical grammar for teachers, and I did the same last fall in different languages, and we tried to see how far we could take this thing. And then I saw some intensive seminar in Thailand last month, and we tried it there too, and it has some interesting possibilities. First of all, when we teach grammar, we am I doing this right? We usually think of inductive versus deductive teaching. Right? Inductive means collecting data, seeing what's going on. Deductive meaning applying rules, and how should you apply them. But there is a third option, which is abductive. That term comes from Charles Sanders Peirce, the philosopher, who says that all scientific work is driven by abduction rather than anything else. And he gives examples of chemistry, physics, how the new discoveries are made in the sciences. And in general, the discoveries are made through abduction, that is, creative exploration, following hunches, trying them out, and then testing hypotheses by going back to induction and deduction as cyclical moments within a larger framework of iterative grammatical work. But the way we envisage it through green grammar is that we start with abduction, that is exploration. So let's see something more about that. What is green grammar? It's action-based, that is, it's based on the activity of the students, which is not just learning rules, but doing something. Doing something. It is abductive in the sense that this doing is exploratory. It is interactive in the sense that the students work together. It's embodied in the sense that grammar cannot be just seen as in terms of rules. It is also seen as embodied action. It's puzzle-based. That is, it looks at grammatical issues from the perspective of what is going on here. And I have some examples of it that we have been trying to work out in my classes. Puzzle-based, the term comes from Dick Allwright, who has done a lot of work on exploratory practice. I'll give some examples. It's playful. It's playful. It's not dull, dreary, and rote memory based, but it's joyful. It's success-oriented, and not the opposite of success-oriented is correction-oriented. So, as a grammar teacher, you could have two stances, basically. You can have the stance of that it is my job to make sure that the students produce grammatically correct language, spoken and written. And to the extent that they don't do so, I have to help them achieve that. And one of the ways of helping to achieve that is by giving them corrective feedback. I think that's a very common general rationale underlying a lot of grammar teaching. A success-oriented way of teaching grammar, on the other hand, says, okay, I'm not going to look at what you cannot do. I'm going to look and see what you can achieve with the knowledge that you have on certain puzzles, maybe, or certain projects, or certain tasks that I give you, and I have some examples of those here. So basically, what we try to do is we try to design activities in which students are really stretched to the limit in terms of their ability to get the job done. But they get, to the extent that I design them well enough, they can get this job done. That is a job which has a range of ways of doing that range from fairly primitive and brief to very sophisticated and accomplished. Along that range, ideally, we would not want to or need to do any correction whatsoever. So that's the challenge. And a lot of grammarians will say, well, that's impossible. That cannot be done. How are they going to get the rules? Well, one of the things, of course, we do is we examine the notion of rule itself as one of the puzzles. So we look at language from an abductive, inductive, deductive perspective, perhaps, and say, okay, now can we come up with a rule? If so, what does the rule do for us? And we find, in fact, in most cases that the rule doesn't do very much for us. Doesn't buy you much. And we look at the rule in the grammar book, and we find the rule in the grammar book does usually not reflect reality, the reality of the language out there. And again, I'll show you some examples. So success-oriented activities focus not on corrective feedback, but focus on instigating and promoting and scaffolding success. It's sustainable in the sense that whatever you do there can be carried around and used and re-embodied and reenacted at any moment in time when it's relevant, which is not something you can easily say of a bunch of grammar rules. You can carry them around in your head, but what you can do with them is not necessarily very much. And I go back to the previous slide and read the bottom sentence here by Phil Johnson Laird, who is a computer science expert. A grammar can provide an accurate description of performance and yet play no part in the production of that performance. He's actually talking, I think, primarily about creating computer programs. But what applies to those, I think, equally applies to everyday language use. That is, you can have a grammar book, and whatever's in the grammar book is good, and it is accurate, etc., etc., etc. It's possible, particularly present-day corpus-based grammars, for example. But they do not play any part in the production of the performance that they describe. So that's the conundrum that we have here. Whereas if you can base your grammar teaching on a success-oriented model, then it is sustainable and you can carry it around and actually use it anytime, anywhere, whenever needed. Because it's not cast in terms of the traditional notion of rule. Okay, here are some possibilities that we have done since last semester. I just chose 3 examples. So we have a Chinese as a foreign language class. The students are divided into groups, and each group is handed a strip with a grammatical problem on it. The teacher just spreads them around. Each group has to discuss amongst themselves and try to understand the grammar point. When here the teacher can come in and help. They have to come up with examples, and then they have to teach it to the whole class. The students found this very challenging, but they said they learned so much by teaching something to somebody else. So it was a very positive experience for the students. Another one was that we tried was, this was in my pedagogical grammar class, we gave two students the task of connecting the laptop to the projector. The laptop was off, disconnected, the pieces were lying around, and one student has to give the other one instructions on how to do it. First you have to, now you have to, and depending on the level of the student, this required more or less body language. Right? It might say, oh, you have to put that thing there. Right? That's much simpler than saying you have to plug in the dongle and then stuff like that. So you know, the level is infinitely scalable or gradable from more simple to more complex. But you cannot say that one is wrong and the other is right. You can just say that one is more sophisticated than the other one. But if they get the projector to work, they're successful. Right? And that was all that matters. And then we do the same thing. So we get back to the semantic cross of the ritual and innovation. We get back to that point of the ritual, and we turn this into a ritual and do it again next week with two other students, and maybe in another language. And gradually the students build up a repertoire of giving people instructions on different things. We can do the same with how to download an app on an iPod, how to operate a digital camera, etc., etc., etc. And as the students go along, they get better and better at it without having had any corrective feedback whatsoever. And this getting better is not just vocabulary, but also grammatical improvement. Here's another one, and here I'm going to show you a little video clip. We can ask students how the order of adjectives works. These are students from different language backgrounds. Chinese, Spanish, German, Russian, whatever. Okay. How does the order of adjectives work in English? So what do you say? You say an old big house or a big old house? No, you say a big old house. Okay. Green. How do you say add green? A big old greenhouse. Yeah, that sounds better. And so on. Okay. So for a while they mess around with this, maybe with questions and saying, I'm not sure what sounds better or not, because they don't have that feeling built in themselves yet. And then I play this clip. And I have to kind of go off here and get to my Firefox. And I hope I still have that bookmarked. Yes. And then I want to see about the sound.
Hello, I'm Professor Grammar, and I want to teach you English. Ha! Hello.
Hello, Professor Grammar.
Oh, sorry I'm late. How are you?
Fine, thank you. And I have a question.
A question? Yes.
Are there any rules for...
Rules? Rules? But of course, there is a rule for everything. There is a rule for everything.
Well, are there any rules for English word order?
Word order.
For example, you're wearing black leather shoes.
They are the finest black leather shoes. They were a present from Mrs. Grammar, my dear wife.
Yes, Professor, but why are they black leather shoes? Why aren't they leather black shoes?
Because there's a rule for everything. Yes, there is a rule for everything. Opshacom. Opshacom.
Opshacom?
Opshacom. Opshacom. Opshacom.
What is Opshacom?
What is Opshacom? O-P, opinion. S-H, shape. A, age. C, color. O, origin. M, material. Opshacom.
So, Opshacom helps us remember the word order of adjectives before nouns.
Correct. Let's look at my shoes again. They are black shoes. Color. They are leather shoes. Material. They are British shoes. Origin. They come from Britain. Great Britain. They are old shoes. Age. They are small shoes. I have very small feet. Shape.
Shape or size.
They are beautiful shoes. Well, that's my opinion. So, they are beautiful, small, old, black, British leather shoes. Opshacom.
But you don't need to use so many adjectives.
Oh, no. But Opshacom will help you with word order. I want to show you something. A rose. And now it's time for an exercise. I want you to make a sentence. I will give you 3 words that describe my rose. It's red, it's lovely, and it's long. It's red, it's lovely, and it's long. Now you make a sentence. Here's some thinking music to help you. Thinking music.
And the answers, Professor?
What? Oh, come along, time's a-wasting. It's a lovely opinion, O-P, long, shape, S-H, red, color, C. It's a lovely, long, red rose for Mrs. Grammar, my English rose.
Aren't you supposed to be meeting her now?
What? Oh, Whaley, I'm late. I must run. I mustn't be late for Mrs. Grammar. Oh, she hates being kept waiting. Oh, she's such a bossy boots. Oh. Until next time, cheerio.
How many of you knew this rule? You've seen this video before? No? So you had Opshacom? All right, good. Okay. But in general, this is not very well known. Then the other thing is So since we have several languages in the class, I think I had 6 or 7 different ones in that particular section. We said, okay, let's compare this order of adjectives to the order of adjectives in the other languages. So they get in little groups or individually, depending, and try and work it out. Now, interestingly, the end result has been, I've done this maybe 3 or 4 times, and every time the results are remarkably consistent. That is, the order is more or less the same in every language that we've tried. First you have some people demurring and say, no, 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 no. It's different in Spanish because we put the adjectives after the noun, not in front, so it doesn't work for Spanish. Well, of course, it's very easy to counteract that because you just start counting from the outside in. And that already shows you that it has something to do with the closeness of the adjective to the noun. Discussing that notion, you go, in a sense, from this particular rule, which I would call a rule of thumb, quite a useful one, but it doesn't give you the reason, right? But if you see that this rule works in many languages, then you say there must be a reason for that. And what is the reason? Anybody? Yes? Some adjectives are more nouny than others. Yeah, okay. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because nouny might not be that... Yeah? Can anybody think of another possible addition to that? Why some adjectives are closer to the noun than others? I'm sorry? I can't. Change, okay. Yeah, closest to the noun means more inseparable from that noun, right? So for British shoes, for example, you can't change those into Spanish shoes. Not possible. But black shoes you could paint over, right? Stuff like that. Or ugly shoes, you could find another person who says, no, 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 they're beautiful.
I think the noun closer, adjective closer to noun is more objective. And then,
yeah, there is the objectivity, subjectivity issue too. Okay, so those are now, we're going below the rule into the reasons for the rule. You see what I'm talking about? And the realization of the students that this is actually quite regular, that this is quite a regular phenomenon, this particular rule, is enlightening, right? It's enlightening because they hadn't thought of that way. They thought it was just a random rule that they can remember by doing Abduction. But if you tell them, well, the order in English is the same as the order in Japanese, then they say, oh, I wonder why. And then this explanation starts making sense. This is just one little example of a way of teaching grammar in a non-rule governed way, but in a way that goes beyond the rules. And we've done the same with very, very complex issues such as aspect, articles, and other things. We're still working on the articles. That is a tough one, I tell you. Because I have Russian, and I have Arabic, and I have Chinese in there. And we are still working on how to figure, so stay tuned. Maybe we come up with the final solution of how to teach the English article system. We'll crack that nut, because so far nobody's been able to do that. We like that, and that's puzzle-based. It's puzzle-based, right? You start with the puzzle. You don't have to start with a rule. Even the rule is not really a rule of, not a deep rule. It is a rule of thumb, and they're very useful. You know, no gainsaying that they're not useful. So where are we? I have just a little bit of time left. I don't want to do that, 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 I don't want to do that. I have some missing. That's happened when you mix and match. That's okay. So we're going back to this. Not there quite yet. I have how much time do I have? 10 minutes. I want to show you a couple of things. And I didn't put them in here in my rush. So let me go to something else. Bear with me for a moment. Let's try this one I did in Finland. Bingo. Okay. Part of it anyway. No, not this one. Let's try this one. I'm sorry about this. I try to... Yeah, okay. So, finishing off by saying something about language and how we could conceptualize or reconceptualize language to teach it ecologically from the perspective of green grammar, you could say, okay, what does language look like? And here would be one way of saying this is what language is. And this is based on the way that usually introductions to linguistics or survey courses of linguistics are structured, right? You have phonetic chapters on phonetics and phonology. You have morphology. You have perhaps a lexical chapter, and then syntax, semantics, and so on and so forth, right? And you say that is language. And of course, now you know what language is. Well, my point here is that I'm not sure if now you know what language is. And then I showed him another picture, which is this one. And that's a picture I took in Paris, just outside the Louvre, near the Seine. Is on this side. And then you say, okay, what is this thing? First of all, you cannot say where it's from easily by looking at the language, because it's not just one language. There are at least several languages represented here on this bus. In addition to which, there are some things that you might, from a grammatical perspective, call incorrect. Design, for example, is not spelled that way. But I have a hunch these people know that. So they have a reason for spelling it that way. Reclame. I first thought that's Dutch, reclame, reclame, but then I thought, no, that would be reclame. Why reclame with two A's? Doesn't make sense. So I go, with the grammarian's eye, I go around this bus, and I don't make sense of it. I can take my red, my spray can, red, and cross out all the words that are wrong. And you can already see this doesn't go very far. So we have here at least an application of language that is not quite the same as in this monolithic previous one, where everything is clear and everything fits perfectly in its own box. Here, it's a riot. It's a riot. Okay, so you're beginning to think, okay, what is this bus doing? Why is it doing what it is doing? And to what extent is this an example of language? I then say, okay, it may not be an example of a language, but it is an example of using language, not on its own, but in the context of other sort of multisensory materials in the environment that they have put together. And then you say, if they're using language that way, are they the only ones, or is there more like this going on? and you get to multi-ethnic neighborhoods, and you walk down the streets of probably anywhere in New York, certainly Tokyo, and cities in Korea and Taiwan, and you take pictures. And I have a series of those pictures, by the way. And you see that there is no such thing as one language, one place, one culture. But rather that every culture, every place is becoming trans-languaged in a number of different ways. And then you say, okay, to what extent are we dealing with that in our classrooms, particularly in multicultural classrooms, where we have students from different language backgrounds who are using 2 or 3 languages between the home and the school every morning and every evening. Yet they come to school, and all the language instruction is based more on this model than on that model. So then you ask yourself, okay, would it be wrong to bring in other languages in my teaching of grammar? Or should I stick to a one language, one system, one monolingual system? Should I allow for this type of mixing? And that is a question that we are also experimenting with. For example, we are collecting photographs and video clips of this notion of trans-languaging. And if we had more time, I could show you a whole slideshow of them, which is quite interesting. And saying, okay, to what extent should this be represented or representable in our classrooms? To what extent would the students be hindered by this in terms of their learning of grammar in a traditional sense and fail their tests? Or would they become more adept and amenable and flexible in the ways in which they create their ways of saying and solving problems? So that's the kind of research that we're looking at right now. This whole area is called linguistic landscape. And a linguistic landscape does not consist of one language, one flag, but of multiple ways of meaning making that incorporate linguistic resources, as it does other visual and other sensory resources. So that's what I thought I would add to this, and to go back to the green grammar notion. We look at what exists rather than what should exist in the eyes of linguists and policymakers or grammar book writers. So if you were to have to write a grammar book based on this versus based on this, what would that look like? And what would such a course look like? And would the students learn more or less? Would they get confused? In my opinion, they would not get confused. They would, I think, become much better observers of language and users of language. So that's the other area that we're looking at. And with that, I think we are done. Okay, that's it. Yeah. Thank you.